Action. Okay.
Visions of the 21st Century, Part 2, insertion at roughly 7 minutes in.
Okay. Put the fabric, the piece of fabric for me, please. There, the other side. Okay. Action.
Now, I'd like to tell you something of these three great visionaries who have provided practical solutions to some of the most serious crises of the 21st century, particularly the ecological crisis and our use of energy. No one is better informed than Lester Brown of the multifaceted crisis facing our planet. And no one has spelt out so clearly how our civilization could be saved from falling over the edge, if there is, hopefully, just time. Now, with Lester Brown, Malthus from the 19th century has seemingly returned, because there's a concentration in Plan B upon the world's food supplies, which are failing. It's long been thought that the world's food supplies have been increasing and that there's no problem with feeding the world population. Lester Brown profoundly disagrees. He claims that there is a damaged environment and consequent collapse of food supplies, causing major problems for civilization and indeed threaten collapse. Now, there are many environmental trends which have been highlighted for decades contributing to this, which are crucial and are going in the wrong direction and are not being reversed. Let's just quickly look at the supply side and the demand side for food supplies. On the supply side, we have collapsing fisheries, now well known. We also have falling water levels in many parts of the planet. We have grassland deterioration. We have soil erosion and deforestation. Never mind the climate warming that is taking place that will affect us in multiple and catastrophic ways. On the demand side for food supplies, we have, of course, continuing population growth, and we have rising standards of living. 3 billion people are, in fact, at this moment, over the last 10 years, have been moving up the food chain. That is, becoming wealthier, entering the middle class, and therefore requiring more consumption. We also points out, Lester Brown, that there's a conversion of grain for fuel. That is, grain has been used for fuel instead of feeding. This all puts great strain, enormous strain, upon our food supplies. This is reflected in substantial rises in commodity prices that he points out at the beginning of the 2000s. There is therefore a crisis in food production, and there's a crisis behind that of energy use and climate change. This is manifested politically in the increasing number of failing states. So if we give a number of markers for failing states, that we mentioned about 18, not now, but you can look them up. The number of states which are failing have doubled in the last 10 years. 10 years ago there was 9 failing states. These are states which just can't function, can't feed their populations, no real government, and fail as governments and states. 10 years ago there was 9, now there are 18. The number of failing states is increasing, and we can see this, for example, in the latest crisis in Venezuela. Plan B is an attempt to offer a solution to stabilise climate, to eradicate poverty, restore the Earth's natural systems, and check unsustainable population growth, all proposed in Plan B with concrete, realistic proposals. The second author is Rifkin, Jeremy Rifkin, the third industrial revolution. Now, the first industrial revolution was caused by steam-powered technology and the printing press. The second was using electrical communication and fossil fuels, especially oil-powered internal combustion engine. And the third industrial revolution is taking advantage of distributed communication systems such as the internet, social networking, collaboration, and distributed renewable energy. Rifkin moves beyond mere panic and presents a grandiose yet potential solution. He gives actual case studies from across the world where political leaders have embraced these changes and are beginning to learn from them and learn how they can be generalized to other countries. He puts much confidence in top-down leadership from the top-down national and regional initiatives. In this respect, these initiatives must come from government and from regions and from the higher echelons of leadership in countries in order to be effective. And he welcomes the third industrial revolution through the change in communication and energy sources. Now, the 5 pillars of the third industrial revolution becoming a post-carbon society are outlined by him. The next author is Lovins, Amory Lovins. His book, Reinventing Fire, Bold Business Solutions for the New Energy Era. He proposes converting the United States, says it's realistic conversion, to almost total reliance on renewable energy sources, such as solar energy and wind power. Renewable energy is already, he claims and argues coherently, convincingly, is already cheaper than fossil fuels. He predicts further reductions in renewable energy prices. And he focuses not so much on top-down procedures of power coming from governments and regional authorities downwards or corporations downwards. He concentrates on people in power who are capable of making this change. The book lays out a plan for the United States, where his chief focus is, to achieve the following by 2050. Cars completely propelled by hydrogen fuel cells, electricity and biofuels. 84% of trucks and aeroplanes running on biomass fuels. And 80% of the nation's electricity produced by renewable power. And $5 trillion in savings are possible, he argues, and that the economy during this whole period can grow. Renewable energy is not going to make us poorer, it'll make us richer if we can embrace this challenge and meet it. By combining reduced energy with energy efficiency gains, he argues, and many others would agree, that there will be enormous savings over the next 40 years and a faster growing economy. This can be done without new federal taxes, subsidies, mandates or laws. The policy innovations needed to unlock and speed it need no act of Congress. The profitable commercialization of existing energy-saving technologies through market forces can be led by business. So these are 3 informative, prophetic and potential solutions which are being offered not just for the United States, but if we look at Lester Brown and others, we can see are being offered for the whole planet, and that there are therefore solutions which are possible in this age of crisis. What it of course requires is the energy and the political will to implement these solutions. So visions of the 21st century.
Okay, day 1.
Part 2, insertion of the 7 horsemen. Take 1.
Okay, you can put the fabric here. The other side. Okay. Okay, just wait. Action.
Now, I should like to summarize for you succinctly the 7 horsemen of the apocalypse and add the 8th really to this, the ecological crisis. So these 7 horsemen envisaged by Weiss start off with debt, as already explained, which was increasing up to the year 2008 in many countries in the Western world, not China incidentally, but many countries of the West in their expansion leading up to the crash of 2008 had expanded on debt. After the collapse or the credit crunch of 2008 and the recession, considerable deep recession that came to the Western economies, the increase in debt was astounding. It was double and sometimes triple the level of national debt, from around, for example, Britain are in the 33% of GDP in debt. doubling to 66 very rapidly, and then soon afterwards increasing to near 90 to 100% of the GDP in national debt. That is the debt owed by government. This was typical in many countries, in some countries even more dramatically so, like Italy or Japan, for example. In other words, the crisis of 2008, this deep structural crisis, proved to be have a very high cost in terms of the debt inflicted upon the West as their way of trying to save the situation. Secondly, the horsemen of money in the apocalypse. The money expansion has of course been considerable. Not only has there been debt, but there has been a considerable expansion of money supply, as already explained. And this was widespread in the Western world leading up to the crisis of 2008 and after the crisis of 2008 in an effort to resolve the crisis or to prevent the West going into a prolonged depression. So terrific money expansion in the West, which basically has got into the hands of bankers, stock exchanges and speculative capital, driving us towards another crisis. Thirdly, the inequality has been increasing throughout. Inequality has been basically increasing in most of the Western world from the 1970s and 80s. It dropped in the 1950s and 60s, but subsequent to that, the inequality, the measures of the income inequality, particularly between the top echelons and the bottom, has widened considerably. The 1978, the top 1% of Americans controlled 23% of the nation's wealth. It's now at 45%. The wealth disparities in Russia and China particularly are even more severe. Fourthly, corruption. The indexes of corruption show that that this accompanies the income inequality and has been a big factor in the impoverishment of the middle and lower classes. And this corruption scandals that have circulated the world in Europe, in South America, in Russia and in China has been on the increase for the last 20 years, but particularly with all this speculative expansion of money and debt, it's allowed terrific corruption to grow. Fifthly, division, particularly political division, which is the surface manifestation of the underlying crisis. So that in any country, take the United States for example, never has the divisions in Congress been wider. Never has there been so many stalled proposals in Congress, which are stalled or impeded by severe political divisions, and which begins to paralyse the country. These divisions are also manifest in Europe, where we get, for example, different countries in Europe breaking away or wishing to disobey the European Union on fundamental policies. So division is breaking out on a large scale in big economies, small scale, for example, in Spain. Just look at, for example, the 2017 events in Catalonia, whereby it was attempting to create its own independence, political division within the Spanish political body and in its economy. So these divisions create movements, extreme movements to the left and to the right, and extreme nationalist movements. You won't see on the surface the political divisions that are in dictatorships, for example in Russia or in the communist system in China, but you'll see it underneath in the amount of rebellions and protests that take place. You won't see it in some Latin American countries which have strong dictatorial components like Venezuela. That's because the underlying protests have been crushed. In other words, the protests and rebellions are significant enough, and when they're crushed at the high political level, it becomes manifested at a lower level. So by one measure or another, either political division in the ruling classes or by number of rebellions at the lower end of the scale, we find the amount of division has increased. Sixthly, the movement towards tyranny. The rise of authoritarianism and dictatorship has been notable. In the 20th century, it took 2 world wars, wars of independence, colonial independence, and decades of struggle to free large parts of the world from the tyranny that existed in the early 20th century, either in the form of colonialism or in threatened fascism. for example in Europe and indeed the world, in the form of Japan and Germany. So struggles for freedom were notable in the mid-20th century, and yet many of the countries that gained their independence in Africa or in Latin America and other parts of the world have simply replaced one tyranny with another tyranny. The opportunities for freedom have been there, but it's been easy to move towards tyranny, especially when there's large amounts of money at stake, there's corruption, scandals, large amounts of wealth can be appropriated by the new ruling classes in these countries. Seventhly, the movement towards war, as we mentioned, is considerable. The rise of authoritarianism has been accompanied by a global rise in nationalism, militarism, and an irresistible rise of the world's powerful autocrats to blame their domestic problems on foreign aggressors. So this blame culture around the world, in which one country blames another for its problems, instead of looking at its own problems and faults within, has become more and more evident. And this eventually can lead to movements to war, particularly when there's a problematic history of invasions or insult that has taken place historically by one country of another, wars and so on, which have created in the social unconscious of that country a resentment, a humiliation which needs revenge. So the movement towards war and the movement towards the military means to do so, increased nuclear weapons, increased weaponry of all kind, has been notable. And these cycles, argues Weiss, of these 7 horsemen, debt, money, inequality, corruption, division, tyranny and war, are now coinciding to create an apocalyptical situation. And this is the, as it were, the veil of death, or the crisis of the 21st century through which we're going to have to pass. Of course, we need to add to that the 8th, which is the ecological crisis. And we need to understand the ecological crisis as systemically, that is, as part of a system, moving with these other horsemen of the apocalypse, these other major crises which are developing, which are all interlocking. We need to understand the ecological crisis as basically interacting with all the rest, creating another level of serious problems. Take, for example, the global warming. We all know that rising sea levels will interact with the tyranny, divisions, corruptions and inequalities that exist in some countries. We'll have massive social migrations, we'll have massive movements towards war, and we'll have new takeovers of authoritarian elites as they struggle with these tremendous problems that are going to break out. Just think of the problems in China and India as the glaciers of the Himalayas reduce and the great feeder waters of the Yangtze and the Yellow River and the Indus and the Ganges, all these rivers which can feed off the glaciers, think of them drying up. Initially you don't notice them drying up, of course, with global warming, but after a certain time they do dry up, and when they do so, these billions of people who depend upon the surrounding farming lands and agriculture will be in a very, very serious problem. That will react systemically with their political and economic systems. So we need to understand these numerous factors in an interdisciplinary manner, as economic and political and military and social and ecological. So such is the interlocking systems which are leading towards this evolving crisis, as I've called it, of the 21st century.